Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bennett Tyler with the Aberdeen Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Priming the Analytical Engine, Accelerated Insight with Efficient Data Prep. The webinar today is hosted by Aberdeen Group and sponsored by SciSense. During this webinar, we will focus on the rising need for efficient and effective data prep, and how proper data prep upfront can lead to faster, more reliable decision-making down the line. Our presenters today are Mike Locke, Vice President and Principal Analyst for the Analytics and Business Intelligence Research Practice here at the Aberdeen Group, and Ani Manian, Head of Product Strategy at SciSense. If you'd like to read their full bios, please use the drop-down arrows below their photos on the left side of your screen. I encourage you all to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A field at the top left of your screen. We will facilitate a Q&A at the end of the presentation and try to address as many of your questions as possible. Also, on the right of your screen, you'll see our resource section. There you will find today's presentation deck, as well as some additional reading on data prep from Aberdeen Group and SciSense. It is now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Mike Locke.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Bennett, and welcome to everyone joining us today. For those of you that are familiar with Aberdeen, you may know how we go about conducting our research and the fact that all the insights and the findings that we gather, they're all derived from people like you. So IT leaders and sales directors and marketing managers and anyone in the business world that sort of has a hand in developing insight based on data. So first, I want to say thanks, not only for joining the webinar today, but for being part of our community, for participating in our surveys, for speaking with us from time to time about your experiences with analytical activity. Really appreciate that. So I've been covering the analytics space now for more than 8 years, and it's a rapidly evolving space, as you probably all know, with a lot of technology advancements. I think of things like data visualization, greater interactivity on the front end. I think of sophisticated big data management technology like Hadoop and its associated stack. But what's really grown in importance are the tools and the processes associated with data preparation. The ability to gather data from multiple disparate sources, collect it, ingest it, cleanse it, and deliver it to the most relevant users within the organization. You know, these activities have become increasingly more important to companies these days, and that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. Speaking of, here's a quick agenda for the discussion today. I've organized this basically into 3 sections, and after each one, I'd like to throw the conversation over to Ani from SciSense to provide his take. I'll start with a little background, talk about some of the biggest trends that are coming out of the research, trends around data growth and the evolving strategies to deal with it. And I'll start the data prep discussion by talking through some of the findings from a report I did not too long ago, talking about some best-in-class strategies for data prep. Then I want to talk more broadly about sort of a more holistic approach to BI that blends together the ideals of data prep with other key pieces of the analytical value chain, so to speak. And then finally close out with some of the key takeaways from the research. So let's jump right into the background here. What's going on in the world of analytics? Obviously, I consider this to be an intriguing and evolving space, and here's why. From our perspective, there are really 3 main trends that can't be ignored. I like to think of it in terms of more, and less. In other words, more data, more users, and less time. So in terms of data, there's a lot of it. We know that. It's increased in complexity. But more and more companies are seeing it as underutilized. In other words, it's shifting from a problem to an opportunity for a lot of companies looking to exploit their data. Where, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been viewed as a struggle to capture all that data, store it, and manage it. And it still is, but back then it would have been more out of pressure from regulations or self-imposed pressure. Companies are now looking to actually do something with that data. On the user side, what we've been seeing for quite some time now is an expansion in the number of people with a need or a desire to make better data-driven decisions. So, from a tactical line of business manager all the way up to the most strategic executive, and a variety of roles in between, more job titles are getting involved. It's also expanded outside of traditional functional use cases for analytics, like finance or sales, users in a variety of departments from HR to customer management, really finding a need for better analytics. And then lastly, in terms of time, factors like the evolving, more demanding customer, a fairly obvious accelerated pace of business these days, companies have less time to make decisions. It might be a case where an operational decision maker accustomed to a daily production report now needs status update twice or 3 times a day, or perhaps a situation where a sales pipeline report once a day instead of weekly. According to the research that I've done, 70% of users report having less time to make decisions, regardless of what that individual decision window happens to be. You may have seen my presentations before. You may have heard me talk about these trends before, but no matter how the space evolves, I really can't get away from them. So it's these concepts of more data, more users, and less time. Just to put a little bit more data, some more findings to the background issues in play, we see some major challenges around data growth and complexity specifically. So from a recent survey we launched, the top reported challenges with data are really around volume, quality, and disparity. Again, it's not so much just an issue of volume and the problems that causes, but it's more about missed opportunity. Companies are frustrated with their inability to utilize the data as it grows rapidly. Quality is, of course, an issue, as is the general concept of fragmentation. Companies feel like so much usable data is locked away within functional silos. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. These days, in particular, the notion that a critical decision would depend on data from just one area of the company it's really increasingly unlikely. So this siloing effect is a real issue. Also worth mentioning here that as you look at these charts, I've broken up the respondents into small, mid-sized, and large companies, really just to prove the simple point that the challenges I'm talking about, they may shuffle around a little bit depending on company size, but they're generally an issue regardless of size of company or size of IT wallet for that matter. If you look at the average number of unique data sources used for analysis, we're not talking about data exhaust here. We're talking about active data sources that companies are using for analysis. Even eight data sources like we see for small companies, between applications and databases, data marts, spreadsheets, it's a lot for a company to wrangle, and it really just goes up from there as you look at larger companies. So really a lot of issues out there with data growth and complexity in particular. At the same time all this is happening in the data layer, you've got a great deal of urgency on the part of end users. And the chart here shows some of the top pressures driving analytical initiatives in companies nowadays. So they no longer want to rely solely on their experience and gut feel. Those will always be a part of the decision process, but they want data. They really want evidence to support their most critical decisions. They see a lot of operational inefficiencies born out of, again, their inability to measure, monitor, improve what's going on at the core of the business. And then there's sort of these combined issues of data disparity and complexity that we already talked about. They look for analytical solutions and activities to help them reach into more relevant data sources within the company, extract some strategic value from all that data growth rather than just storing it again for compliance purposes or other reasons. These are the things that users like the folks like you point to over and over again as the drivers behind their need for analytics. So really briefly here, in order to put the rest of the data in a better context, I wanted to talk through the Aberdeen research methodology. Through the surveys that we conduct and the conversations that we have, we're always trying to better understand how solutions like analytics are being used in organizations and the value that the tools are delivering. But we do that in two main parts. The first piece of our methodology involves understanding the user mindset. And in order to do that, we use a framework called PACE, which stands for Pressures, Actions, Capabilities, and Enablers. We want to understand what keeps people up at night in terms of their most critical decisions. What pressures are they facing? Some of the things we talked about before, needing data and evidence to support their decisions, needing to expand access to more information. We want to know what strategic actions they're taking in response to those pressures. So things like their data and technology strategy, their hiring philosophies, et cetera. We look at the capabilities that they have in place aside from the technologies, things like knowledge management capabilities, skill sets they're building, technology management, things like that. And then the E of PACE is for enablers, and this is really where the technologies come into play. What are those tools that they're using in order to round out their strategy and perform better when it comes to their analytical initiatives? So the second half of our methodology, now that we understand, how these users are thinking, what keeps them up at night, what they're doing to structure their organizations, we want to know how they're performing as a result. So in all of our surveys, in addition to asking them questions about these 4 PACE areas, we're asking them questions about performance. So metrics like operational goals, employee productivity and performance, as well as some sort of key line item financial metrics in some cases. What we then do is score each respondent based on how they answer those questions. The ones that score in the top 20% of that pool of survey takers are what we refer to as best in class. Middle 50% are the industry average, and the bottom 30% are the laggards. And oftentimes what we'll do is actually break them down into 2 categories of leaders versus followers. I haven't done that for this particular presentation, but it's sort of a different breakdown based on performance. At the end of the day, though, all of those numbers aside, the real value of the methodology, I think, is its ability to connect superior performance to the activities and the strategies that led to it. So whether we're talking about best-in-class companies or leaders, we want to know what these companies are doing differently. What processes and capabilities do they have in place? What skill sets are they hiring and developing? What technologies are they deploying to help create more effective decisions and drive the business forward? That's really what the methodology is all about. So before I move on to the next section here, I wanted to pause for a moment, and as I mentioned at the outset, I wanted to get Ani's take on some of this background. So I'm actually going to jump back a couple of slides here. So obviously, these concepts, data complexity and disparity, these have become a major issue for a lot of companies, and the impact to the infrastructure and the IT organization is usually at the center of that discussion. But the impact to the line of business isn't talked about quite as much. So Ani, if you would, I'm curious, how do you see some of these data-related challenges manifesting themselves within some of these less technical line of business roles?
Thanks, Mike. I feel like the reality is for the line of business at most organizations, BI is still a headache and not really a savior. Now, the growing complexity of data is starving line of business with valuable context that they would need to make better decisions. So talking about impact, let's look at the financial impact for a second. More money is spent on BI technology every year than the GDP of half the world's countries. Just last year, companies spent $14 billion just on BI software. But the funny thing is, the real expense is not just procuring the software, but what companies spend to make BI actually work. So that 14 billion number is only a fourth of the total cost of BI. The other 75%, that's $55 billion, is spent on services just to get BI up and running. And this is something that line of business suffers a lot with. Now, once all this is done, unfortunately, only 24%, another fourth of the entire organization's employees actually get to use these tools to get the data that they need to do their jobs. Now, the remaining 76% they spend days and weeks waiting for their reports, and that's just not acceptable. So line of business is actually really suffering for the current state of BI. Now, it doesn't actually have to be this way. What we've seen is that newer tools can actually allow business users to incorporate all their disparate data sources with very little need for technical skills. And this actually frees up IT to focus on mission-critical work. Now, we're seeing this with our customers, and most of them are actually coming from line of business. So I feel like line of business now has much more opportunity with a newer slew of tools to actually get a much higher ROI from BI. I'm going to turn it back to you for the next section now.
Great, thanks, Ani. I appreciate that. And some interesting stats there. I can say from my own research, I agree. These concepts of the amount of time and money that are spent in the analytical process I hadn't heard it put in GDP terms before, but that's really interesting. And I think the takeaway for me is that with this amount of effort that's being spent, and regardless of the tools and technologies that are in place, it ought to be delivered in a way that is relevant to a decision maker that doesn't necessarily have a PhD in statistical analysis. And I think that that's a big part of the drive that companies are seeing today, to get more active within the analytical process. And that's actually a really good lead-in to my next section here, when we talk about data preparation, the notion that these users want to take more ownership of their decisions and the data that sort of supports them. So I want to talk a little bit more about, this concept of data preparation here. So this chart here is from my last big data study, talking about the biggest challenges with data, the things that most likely hinder effective analytics. And what we see actually is a lot of similarity with some of the line of business pressures that we saw before. This is actually more from the perspective of a data professional and IT folks. The disparity challenge is really at the top of the list, and across the board, as companies struggle with this silo effect, where data is locked away within other applications, residing in other departments across the company. And compounding that, making it worse, there's some pretty serious resource constraints at these companies when it comes to the skill sets required, to access and incorporate that data, which then, of course, leads to a lot of the spend in terms of obviously money and effort that Ani had referred to before. There's a great deal of, additionally, there's a great deal of demand coming from the line of business, demand for faster information, demand for higher quality data. So as users are unsatisfied with the quality of data that support their most critical decisions, it's becoming a real problem. This is something that I'll speak to a little bit more later in the presentation. So, with those challenges in mind, I wanted to understand what constitutes a company that does it right with data preparation. So this comes from a study that I did not too long ago, and what we're looking at here are the metrics that I use to define best-in-class companies and the actual weighted average performance against those metrics. So companies that really have their act together when it comes to managing data, they're able to produce a foundation of data records that are inherently more accurate, more complete compared to other companies. They're more likely to empower their users with higher quality data. Best-in-class companies are 4 times more likely to be satisfied with data quality than any other company that we surveyed. And then, the ever-present metric of preparation time. This is probably, I don't know if this is something that you guys track or if it's just sort of something that's on top of your mind, but you hear a lot of complaints that a large portion of the time, regardless of whether we're talking about a data scientist or a business analyst or a technically savvy marketer or whatever, there's a tremendous amount of time spent gathering and preparing data rather than analyzing it and delivering insight. 95% of best-in-class companies were able to reduce this data prep time, whatever that amount of time may be. The ability to pare that down and shift the balance toward analyzing data and delivering it to the users that need it or using it yourself, that's a really important metric and one that we use to define best-in-class companies. So aside from their efficiency with data, what other things do these companies do to help them perform and transform data into insight? A lot of that has to do, again, outside of just the technologies that they're using. The research shows that companies, best-in-class companies, are more likely to have analytics elevated to a level of strategic priority within the executive ranks. This is a little bit buzzwordy, this concept of C-level buy-in, but the simple fact is, when you have a champion or someone at a senior level that can provide support, potentially funding, and essentially air cover for the programs that are in place, it's so much greater chance of success for these programs. Best-in-class companies almost twice as likely to have that in place. They're more organizationally mature from a process standpoint in their focus on responsible governance and oversight of the data environment. So while at the same time they're providing access to more data, which we'll talk about in a second, they're also more likely to sort of oversee it and govern it in a responsible way. They're more likely to develop analytical skill in-house to sort of enhance the overall company ability to use data. So a lot of companies have what I like to call analytical talent lying dormant under the surface of the workforce. They're more likely to have processes in place and programs to help draw that talent out. Also important when it comes to data prep, they're much more likely to have these capabilities integrated with the other aspects of the analytical value chain, such as things like visualization, interactive visualization reporting, as opposed to a standalone solution. This really makes it easier to help them really arm and empower those line of business users. And another interesting characteristic that top companies share is their likelihood of using really a multitude of different disparate data types. So it's not just that they're accessing a variety of different applications and a variety of different data warehouses. They're using different types of data. So not just traditional structured data, transactional data. They're using third-party data, whether it's firmographic, demographic data from a third party. They're using unstructured information, things like text-based, obviously social media-generated data. They're using IoT data, sensor machine-generated data. They're using location-based or geospatial data. All of these different types of data are sort of the foundation of what best-in-class companies use to generate insight. And you see across the board they're way more likely to be using this broadened sort of variety of data in their analyses to help enrich their decisions with a more solid foundation. So being close to this space for a long time, as I talked about earlier, I've been exposed to a variety of different use cases and methods for utilizing all of this data. But I wanted to take another opportunity here to pass things off to Ani to help put a little bit of color to this. Obviously, the research like this chart here, it shows that the top companies are exploiting a really broad array of data beyond just traditional structured data. Ani, what are some of the interesting use cases that you've seen for combining different data like unstructured or location-based data, for example?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting that these days you can't take a single breath without somehow creating more data, and the amount of data is really exploding all over the place. Now, with unstructured data specifically, now that's not really a particularly precise term, because that just means data that's difficult to deal with because it usually doesn't have a data model inherent. Now, a lot of the information available to companies these days is in the form of unstructured data, unfortunately. And it's really hard to say exactly how much. Now, text-based unstructured data is by far the most common type we see. But there's lots of other forms like the location data that you mentioned. Now, one of the most dominant use cases that we see among, thousands of clients that we see is analyzing the voice of the customer. Now, organizations have been trying for years to figure out exactly what their customers think. But the problem is they've been doing it indirectly by examining transactional data in terms of what's being sold, what's being returned, what has warranty claims, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with text analytics, they can actually listen to what the customers are saying by going out to blogs, product forums, and really all other places, particularly social media, where they discuss products, problems that they have, what they like when they share the love for the different brands, and analyzing this unstructured text that's coming from social media data sources is often the first and most appropriate use case for companies to begin the analysis of this data and demonstrate ROI before they move on to other more complex use cases. Now, we see other use cases like financial trading, TV advertising, audience analysis. I mean, we see this in the recent election. There's a lot of semantic analysis of, the different words that come up between the presidential debates. And even location analytics is being used increasingly to determine where, retail stores open new branches, which stores they actually augment with more staff. And this is particularly relevant for the retail and hospitality industry. The transportation and logistics industry is also using all this location data to do their planning and demand forecasting, for example. So we're seeing really interesting use cases for this unstructured data, but as you mentioned, this is becoming really hard for most companies to actually wrangle and make sense of, without sort of really investing in BI and really committing to that process.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hear about a lot of the use cases for analytics these days, and a lot of the times, someone in my position as an analyst covering the space, a lot of what dominates those conversations are marketing use cases for analytics, and it's unstructured data, or as one executive at one of the companies I've talked to before likes to call it, data that has yet to have structure applied to it. You think about all the different ways that you can apply the ideals of analytics to this type of data. I mean, you talked about several of them, Ani, but the ability to understand competitive behavior, the ability to shape and reform the product strategy based on customer sentiment analysis through online reviews and tweets and things like that. The possibilities are really endless, and that's really just one corner of this world of expanding data, as you said. So a lot of interesting use cases there, obviously, but it also ties into the concept that I'm going to be talking about next, because when you think about the ability to take something like unstructured data, whether it's IoT data, social data, turn it into something useful for a decision maker to act on that's gonna really drive business value. That you really need to have what I consider to be a holistic view of business intelligence, and you could take this a number of different ways, but let me talk a little bit more about what I'm referring to here. Best-in-class companies, if you think about the ability to create insight, you're going to have certain aspects of this analytical value chain anyway. You're going to have some sort of activity going on in the data layer to capture and store and organize it. The ability to pull it into different analytical applications, to apply rules to it, create visualizations of it. The point here, though, is that best-in-class companies, they really have an elevated level of maturity and technology activity across several of these areas, but sort of in an elevated way. Let me talk a little bit more about that. They're more likely to deploy high-performance, big data tailored data warehouses. They're more likely to be exploring technologies in or attached to the Hadoop ecosystem to create a data lake environment that can handle all of these different types of data in their native formats. They're more likely to be active in their analysis process through the use of data discovery, interactive visualization, allowing them to explore and create insight rather than just consume it. And they're also more likely to be exploring some of the more advanced and predictive methods for employing analytics and modeling to their data. So best-in-class companies really more likely to utilize this holistic, comprehensive approach to BI. But putting that on hold for a second, though, part of the reason that these best-in-class companies are more mature, both in the breadth of the technology that they deploy and their internal processes and their maturity, it's really their recognition of this widespread level of dissatisfaction on the part of users when it comes to the data environment. If I think back to the raw data from my survey, I asked a simple question on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with these 5 or 6 aspects of your data environment, things like data quality, your ability to access the data in a self-service capacity, the relevance of that data to your job role, the speed and timeliness of delivery of that data. If you look at the respondent pool in general, the vast majority of survey respondents report either being indifferent or, in some cases, very dissatisfied with these aspects. If you look at best-in-class companies, though, it's not the case. So the gap between best-in-class companies and all others when it comes to these critical aspects of the data environment, the quality of the data, the self-serviceability, self-sufficiency of accessing it, the timeliness and the speed of delivery, best-in-class companies much more likely to report being satisfied or very satisfied with these aspects of the data environment. So really focused on empowering the users on the front end who are actually charged with making business critical decisions based on, in large part, on the data that's being provided to them. So back to this concept of holistic BI for a second. On this slide, what I've actually done is isolated companies that have that holistic approach to BI, where they're deploying a more comprehensive end-to-end analytical strategy like we saw for best-in-class companies a few slides ago. When you compare these companies to all others, some pretty interesting discrepancies arise. So these companies are much more likely to drive improvement in key areas like their visibility into business data. They can access and utilize a broader array of information. The amount of time spent collecting and compiling data, as you talked about before, these companies much more likely to reduce this time frame. And then the accuracy of their analyses. So faster access to more information allows for better modeling of the data, allows for better and more relevant insights, and that's what these companies are enjoying. And additionally, though, at the end of the day, it's always interesting to see the correlation drawn between data efficiency and performance. So companies that reported having this holistic approach to BI, if I can get this slide to come up in the window, there it is. These companies that have that holistic approach to BI, able to drive greater efficiency in the decision process, as well as some pretty tangible sort of, again, line item financial metrics. This approach, when you have that comprehensive approach to analytics, helps companies accelerate the flow of information across the business, helps lead to accelerated decisions, faster time to market with products and services. So that efficiency in the decision environment and the internal environment helps allow them to exploit more opportunities to drive growth in the business and reduce cost, ultimately leading to the types of revenue growth and operating profit improvement that we're seeing here. So, the efficiency and speed of decisions internally leads to the ability to act and exploit opportunities on the front end of the business, and really drives some pretty tangible, pretty enticing performance improvements. So just to recap a few of the takeaways from the research findings here, whether you're talking about the line of business or IT, technical staff, the challenges with data they're real, obviously. They require a more formal approach to managing and preparing data. Companies are dealing with a larger user base that's clamoring for better data, higher quality data that's delivered on time. There's a greater level of urgency, and there are also serious resource constraints across most companies. So the ability to use some of these technologies more efficiently free up IT resources to focus on things more strategic to the business than perhaps creating, changing a pie chart color from magenta to brown. Those are pretty important things for companies these days. Secondly, when you look at best-in-class companies, when it comes to data prep, in addition to the technologies that they use, they're really focused on empowering users with better data in a variety of different ways, like we talked about before. Higher quality data, more likely to be delivered on time, more relevant to the role that they're in and the decision that they're making. And then finally, this concept of a more comprehensive or holistic approach to BI really shows results for companies. And again, it's not only because of the technology, but the overall philosophy toward analytics, having an elevated focus on improving different aspects of collecting and preparing data, on modeling it more efficiently and more relevant to the business, on delivering it in a more timely way, really helps improve the decision process internally, and leads to some pretty tangible and pretty enticing performance improvements. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Before we throw things back to Bennett and start the Q&A, I wanted to get a little perspective again from Ani on this concept of holistic BI and its value for companies. Ani, can you make this real for us again? What are some of the efficiencies that can be gained by having this more comprehensive end-to-end approach to analytics?
Absolutely, Mike. For me, it was personally very eye-opening to see that gulf between the best-in-class companies and everyone else in terms of how satisfied they are. And this is really, really puts into context the enormous amounts of money that is being spent on BI, only to actually end up with very little actual satisfaction or value. And I think one of the reasons why we see this is because, BI is hard. BI is really hard. And, often, companies go out and make a purchase. They buy a certain tool that, can do one aspect of the entire BI value chain. But they realize that often they need something else to go right besides it, something behind it. And they end up with a cobbled together BI stack, which doesn't really actually meet their needs. Now, the approach that, we see work really well, and I think that the best-in-class companies are actually taking, is going for a more holistic approach to BI, which, it's often called single stack BI or full stack BI. And this actually offers several efficiencies, specifically over cobbling together, a bunch of point solutions. So we see these best-in-class companies actually do really well in terms of time to market. I mean, it's always much, much, much faster when you have, a holistic approach to BI. Their overall total cost of ownership with TCO is actually much lower. They don't need to invest necessarily in all this additional hardware. They don't need to pay maintenance and support on, 6 different tools. And they also have a single throat to choke if they actually need help. It's easier to diagnose and mitigate issues when something comes up. When organizations use a hodgepodge of tools, each vendor can actually displace the blame on someone else or the tool behind theirs in the stack, because it's just very, very hard to actually isolate and correct issues. So it's really no surprise to us that single ownership and accountability actually really makes a difference. Now, that said, all single-stack BI platforms aren't created equal. Now, the dominant technology used in the market is still in-memory, and in-memory based tools are actually plagued by bottlenecks caused by needing to load all the data into the RAM. Now, RAM is limited, RAM is expensive, and it actually keeps you from enjoying, full data exploration with really good granularity. So if, I would generally avoid in-memory tools for those on the call if you actually want full granularity and scale without compromising on performance. Now, this is actually one of the key reasons why we created Sisense, was to give companies an alternative to having to either spend insane amounts of money on legacy tools that scale really well and can handle, all these diverse, complex data sets, or cheaper in-memory tools that actually limit the value that you can actually get and end up leading with, these low satisfaction scores. So, Mike, awesome. I think I'll turn it back to you for our Q&A.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ani. I think I appreciate that the last answer there. BI is hard. I think this is sort of an issue that comes up in all the conversations that I have. So I appreciate the perspective there. I think what we want to do now is go ahead and hand things back to Bennett, and we can jump right into the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mike. As they mentioned, that brings us to the end of the presentation portion of today's webinar. We're going to move on to the Q&A portion. And again, if you have any questions, you can submit them using the Q&A widget on the top left-hand side of your screen. So to start us off, I've got a question, and Mike, I'm going to throw this to you first, but Ani, feel free to jump in after he's finished. Mike, why are users so disappointed with data quality? Is it really a lack of technology or just a process issue?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's sort of both and neither, and here's what I mean by that. I think that a big part of what's going on has to do just as much with an increase in expectations on the part of users. And, this is, you could pick your technology advancement in our personal lives of the day, but I think the familiarity that we have in our everyday lives with accessing data about every aspect of our life, whether it's, social media data through Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever it is, where the immediacy with which we require information these days is driving the same type of immediacy in expectations in the business world. So people want they want perfectly clean data. They want it exactly in time to make their decisions, and they're not satisfied when things go wrong. When they bump into issues with multiple versions of the truth. When they're accessing customer information, they're missing fields. When there are 12 different ways of referring to the same company in their database, when their customer information is wrong, when they produce a sales report that conflicts with a different department's interpretation of what's going on in the business. These things wreak havoc on companies trying to make data-driven decisions. So there's an increased expectation for the right kind of data, and they want it on time. And that's not necessarily, it's not. I don't consider that an issue of business users having overinflated expectations necessarily, but it certainly puts a strain on everyone in the ecosystem that's involved in creating and supporting the data environment. So it's definitely a big challenge. I think that there are process issues in play sometimes where there's a lack of governance. People are writing back to the systems of record without having the right to do so. Whether they're updating fields when they shouldn't. They're accessing data that they shouldn't have access to. So that there may be issues with process, with oversight and governance. There may be a fundamental problem with the lack of the right technologies being used. I think it's sort of a bit of both of those, but I think the bigger issue is sort of the increased expectations. What do you think about that, Ani? Agree, disagree?
So I really like what you said, and I want to offer sort of a different perspective. You and I, we met last week at the Strata Hadoop conference, which for those listening in to the discussion, is really focused on big data, and this has been happening for 5-6 years. And we've seen the same sort of claims being made by big data companies again and again and again, and honestly, business is getting tired of it. And the reason is that big data is only as useful as the meaning that you can derive from it. And the truth is that only a small percentage of the data that these large repositories contain is actually useful. And even smaller percent is actually properly analyzed. So what we're seeing is that having lots of data is only part of the solution. It's not the entire thing. Now, segmenting it, making it easier to use, providing a clear purpose for identified sets of users from the big data is another core set of the requirements. Now, it's these insights that you can generate from the big data that actually provide the opportunity for organizations to gain a competitive edge over the competition. But unfortunately, this is far less discussed compared to the big data itself. So, I think it behooves each one of us to ask certain questions as we sort of take away from this discussion. Is how many people in our organization actually have access to data? What are the roadblocks that are keeping them from getting access to this data? What are the KPIs that different line of business users are responsible for, and can they get these at the right time and place? And what we find is that, if we start from the end requirements, from the end value that we want to generate, we would actually end up being a lot more lean and focused in our approach and implementation to BI, because we actually start with what we want, not start with what we have. And often, that can mean the difference between being satisfied and successful, or, spending lots of money and ending up with not much value.
All right. Thank both of you for those great answers. Moving right along, I have another question that I'm going to throw Mike your way first, and then Ani, once again, feel free to jump in. Do these capabilities work best as standalone applications or integrated within other business applications?
So there's a lot of interesting debate on this right now, because one of the things that I'm tracking, one of the biggest trends that I'm tracking in my coverage of the analytics space, is the concept of embedded analytics, right? So many users out there today, we're talking about line of business, non-technical users. There are so many people out there today that every single day of their working lives, or close to it, they're interacting with some software tool on a daily basis, generally, whether it's a CRM system or to understand their customers. It's an ERP system and some of the financials that go along with that. There's manufacturing execution systems as companies are interacting with on a daily basis. There are arguments to be made that a reasonable way or even a very effective way to deliver analytics is through a process called embedded analytics, where the tools are basically enabled within these everyday tools that companies are using. Now, that doesn't mean that there's zero value in a standalone approach, but it sort of depends a little bit on the user type. I think that there's certainly been a growth in the need for data scientists these days. I don't know that there has been a market growth in a number of data scientists. They're certainly in demand, but for roles whose sole job it is to interact with data and to turn it into insights, then a standalone approach probably makes more sense. But certainly if you're talking about line of business users and the way that they're going to deliver and consume insights, or create or consume insights, that embedded approach is one that is definitely growing in popularity. It depends on the organization. It depends on the users in place. But it's definitely one that I personally find interesting.
It's really interesting because for us, we see it really depend on the use case. At Sisense, we, across thousands of companies that we enable, we see an exact, almost uncanny exact 50-50 split between standalone use of BI and embedded BI. And I fully expect embedding to become even more common in the future. Now, I've built several end-to-end analytic stacks from a product perspective at previous SaaS companies I've worked with, and each time I've actually regretted it because it's cost too much money, it took too much time, and it really focuses the team away from the core competency of the actual product. So, ultimately this is a UX issue. Business users want the context that they need while staying on task without any context switches. Now, this is why, it's one of the reasons why Sisense is embedding BI, in fact, in the physical world. So we actually launched a voice-activated assistant that you can talk to, an IoT lamp that glows a certain color that indicates your KPI, and you can motivate entire teams that are sitting around. Now, BI, we believe, needs to work for the user, not the other way around.
All right, thanks again. This next question is for Ani. At the end of the presentation, you said BI is hard. So how does one make it easier then?
That is a really, really good question, a really tough one. I think, there's a few methodologies in the software world that we've seen take the world by storm, and one in particular that's close to my heart, which is Agile. Now, what Agile says is that, we know that requirements change. We know that, the situation and circumstance is going to change. Our needs are going to change. Like, there's always, everything is in flux around us. Technology is rapidly evolving. The number of data sources is growing. The amount of complexity that business users need to contend with is growing. And, it's really no surprise that BI is hard. It's going to be hard because all the variables are constantly in flux. Now, I think what business users need to start with is a clear understanding of what their needs are. Now, every business user can essentially boil down the metrics that they're measured against into a list. Now, if you start with this, if you do an audit of all the different KPIs and metrics that the organization needs visibility into, how often they need visibility into this, they can work backwards and actually start understanding if they have access to these data sources. Now, starting with a clear set of requirements is actually one of the most compelling reasons for success that we actually see. Because a lot of, businesses that lead and kick off a search for BI, they start out because they hear all this buzz in the marketplace. Everyone needs BI. There's all this big data. It's increasing complexity. What are you doing about it? Now, when you start off a search, it's like going to a grocery store without a shopping list. You end up buying a lot, not often what exactly you want. And so I think the number one thing that I would urge everyone here to do is audit the KPIs and the metrics and the intelligence that they would like access to. The current state of this, is the data available? Are people able to get this information? How often can they get it? Are there any roadblocks or obstacles in getting this information? And come up with, a well-articulated set of requirements. And I think the second part is pick a platform that works for you. I think there's enough modernization and availability of self-service tools out there that can really work for you instead of making you jump through hoops and eventually, not actually delivering much satisfaction. So I think starting out with a clear set of requirements and really taking the time to investigate and validate tools that work for you. And one of the things that you might be thinking is, well, as someone looking for a BI solution, how do I validate this? How do I know that a tool is going to work for me? And what I'd urge you all to do is when you speak to a BI company, see if they can visualize your metrics with your data before you actually purchase. Because a lot of times you can buy something and wait months, often years, to actually realize any value. So if they can show you a clear articulation of your metrics, the context that you need to run your business better with your data, that will actually give you the confidence that the solution might actually work and serve your needs.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and as the analyst in here, this may sound grotesquely oversimplified, but I think that the biggest piece of advice I would give, and if I had answered first, by the way, Ani, I agree wholeheartedly. Take stock of your user needs, understand which data sources you need to access, what are the metrics that you're going to need to visualize. That's all critically important, and that's sort of the step-by-step process that I would recommend, just sort of off the cuff here. But I think the biggest thing for me, I would say, is don't. I mean, if you're just embarking on this, or if you're trying to deliver a new solution to the workforce, don't necessarily try to bite off more than you can chew right away. I think that we just returned, as Ani mentioned, from the Strata Hadoop conference in New York last week, and you're inundated with these incredibly sophisticated and impressive use cases for big data and analytics. And it's enough to make your head spin. At the end of the day, though, if you're trying to arm a bunch of marketers or sellers with tools that they can use to run their business better, they need one or two or three metrics that they really, really care about. And if you can find a way to deliver them the ability to see those metrics when they want them, have them updated in a way that is meaningful for the business, And then, from time to time, explore what's underneath those metrics in sort of a hierarchical way. I mean, that's sort of what's going to deliver the most value. Then once you get a feel for who your users are, what your infrastructure looks like, what types of data that you have, then you can start to get into some of these more sophisticated, really interesting use cases like we've talked about. But I think that a lot of the things that Ani talked about in concert with the notion of keep it relatively simple and be successful early and then build out from there, I think is probably the best advice I could offer.
All right, we've got a few minutes left, so I just want to throw one more question at you guys before we wrap up. Centering around small businesses. So, Ani, why don't you start us off with this one, Sisense angle, and then Mike, you can jump in with anything that the research might help out with. So, I'm primarily interested in using analytics in small, less than 100 people, companies and organizations. I don't see how tools that target really large companies can fit into a small company with a small budget.
That's a really good question. So I'll give you a great example. So here at Sisense, our goal is to make BI a fundamental right for every company, not the privilege of the few with enormous budgets. And unfortunately, this is the reality that's been the case in the entire BI, history for the past, 15 years. We came from the world where companies are small, bootstrapped, are lean on resources, are lean on budgets, are lean on IT stuff, and they really still needed to understand their business metrics to actually grow, right? And it's a catch-22. You can't expect to grow if you don't have access to the information, but if the information comes at a really high price, then as a small company, you're really in a deep spot. So Sisense, for example, is specifically designed to empower small companies, nimble companies, to get up and running with a full end-to-end BI stack, visualize all their data sources, and actually have something that carries with you through your journey and through your growth. Now, you as a company are going to change. Your customers are going to grow, your revenues are going to grow, you're going to become more successful, and you're going to generate more and more and more data. Now, you shouldn't outgrow your tool. And so what we have done is actually provide the sweet spot of being able to handle lots of disparate sources, lots of data complexity, but deliver it with complete self-serviceability, ease of use, and allow business users to actually manifest their own destiny instead of relying on, specialized resources, specialized hardware, and, really spending a lot of money to make all this happen.
Yeah, just the only thing I would add to that is I am a fan of, an advocate for, and have worked at many small businesses. My business education was in entrepreneurial business, so I understand the needs of smaller companies. One thing I'll tell you is that in a lot of the research that I've done, a lot of these large organizations that we think of as behemoths with enormous budgets, they actually function like a bunch of individual smaller SMBs and 100, 200 person companies. So sometimes there's a centralized budget that you can tap into and provide tools across thousands and thousands of users. That certainly happens. But a lot of times what you have are these individual fiefdoms of users and that need access to better decision making, and they don't have the time, they don't have the energy, they don't have the resources to tap into the central IT organization, and they need to basically do this themselves. I've heard it referred to as shadow IT, whatever you want to call it. A lot of what you hear about happening at enterprise level companies is almost identical to what would happen at a small company, a 100 person company. I mean, you may not be using incredibly sophisticated, Hadoop stack, data lakes, things like that, but a lot of the fundamentals are the same. The ideals apply, and I don't work for any particular vendor, but I agree with the notion that Ani said that analytics and data-driven decisions should be a fundamental right of any company, regardless of size or budget. So I think there are a lot of companies out there, small and large, that are getting a lot of value out of this when they can apply the resources the right way and do it the right way.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike and Ani. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, everyone. I want to thank our speakers, Mike and Ani, for sharing your research, insights, and recommendations with us today. And a thank you to our sponsor, SciSense, for making this webinar possible. We hope you found today's broadcast to be beneficial, and if you have any final questions, you can submit them to our speakers. We have their contact information up on the screen as well as in the bio widget. At the conclusion of the webinar, we have a short survey about today's event. We'd like to hear any feedback you have on our webinars and appreciate your time. Aberdeen Group's next webinar will be on Wednesday, October 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Aberdeen's Omer Minkara will be discussing the benefits of proper data management in customer experience. You can register by clicking the teal AG logo on the bottom right of your screen. Thank you very much for your participation, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.